Hello and welcome to the Chaos Standard Podcast. I'm Uncle Flacco and I'm so glad you've joined me here today. Today's episode is about a topic that most of you have probably never thought that much about because the answer seems so obvious. And that topic is pushing the limits, aka playing more than 60 cards. But before we get into that, we have a time honored tradition around here to state the current format. We're currently in the middle of format number 3, which contains Zendikar, Dominaria, Strixhaven, 8th edition, Rivals of Ixalan, and Ravnica Allegiance, with expressive iteration on the ban list. And with that, let's dive straight into the topic. So, why do we play 60 cards? This seems like such an obvious question that I shouldn't even have to answer it, but for the sake of everyone listening and for the sake of breaking rules, we have to first establish them. So, in Magic the Gathering, the minimum deck size for a constructed deck is 60 cards. Along with that, the maximum number of copies per card that you can play is 4, other than basic lands, of course. So, let's do a little bit of math. If we have a deck with, 24 basic lands and then 4 copies of any other card, in order to get up to 60 cards, we have to play 9 other cards. And when we're playing 9 cards minimum in our deck, some of those cards are going to be better than others in certain situations. You put in some cards you want to see early and some cards you want to see late. In order to have the best chance of drawing any particular card when you want to draw it, you play as few cards in your deck as possible, aka playing 60 cards. This extends to your sideboard as well. You are allotted 15 cards in your sideboard to put in whatever you want. If you are bringing in a card from your sideboard, it is often going to be one of, if not the best card against your opponent's deck. And in order to see your sideboard cards as often as possible, you make your deck as small as possible to give yourself the biggest chance of drawing the cards that are good against your opponent's deck. I want you to keep those things in mind when we talk about why, oh why, would you ever play more than 60 cards? And first, before we go over Chaos Standard, I want to go over other constructed formats. And by far, the biggest reason why you would ever play more than 60 cards is Yorion Sky Nomad. Yorion is a companion, which means that if you meet a certain deck building restriction, you can reveal the card before you start the game, and then you can pay 3 generic mana and put it into your hand. Relevantly, Yorion's deck building restriction is playing at least 20 cards above the minimum deck size. So, Yorion is a 5 mana 4/5 that, when it enters the battlefield, exiles any number of non-land permanents you control and returns them to their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. The decks that use Yorion are decks that maybe have some sort of have a lot of permanence with enters the battlefield effects, or maybe the decks have a lot of tutors, especially permanent based tutors, and or they're playing Force of Will and you just use Yorion as a way to put a blue card into your hand. A couple of examples of decks that play Yorion are Pioneer Enigmatic Fires and Legacy Death and Taxes. There has also historically been some sort of 4 or 5 colored Green Sun Zenith control deck that can play Yorion. And there have also been decks in Modern that have played Yorion, but Yorion is actually banned in Modern now, so you won't actually be seeing Yorion in Modern anymore. A card that you will see in Modern, but pretty much nowhere else, is Battle of Wits. Battle of Wits is 3 generic and 2 blue for an enchantment that simply reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 200 or more cards in your library, you win the game. So, where to start with this card? Well, 5 mana win the game is still a pretty good rate, even in 2024. And the card was printed like 25 years ago. That's absolutely crazy. But even though there is usually no maximum deck size, you have to be able to shuffle your deck in a reasonable amount of time in a tournament setting. And 240 cards is usually a little bit too big for players to handle. So the only place you would really see this deck is on Magic Online, where people will occasionally 5-0 with the deck, and then content creators will copy the 5-0 list and play through a league with it and probably go like 2-3 because the deck is very inconsistent. The deck is usually filled with a ton of tutors, a ton of other combos that 2-card combos that win the game, right? You can draw one of the pieces and then tutor out the other. And if all else fails, sometimes you just draw the 5 mana win the game card. And finally, there are certain combo decks that go more than 60 cards for a particular reason. I will be highlighting 3 here. The first one is actually a banned deck, the 80-card Pioneer Spy deck. So when Zendikar Rising came out, people knew that Balustrade Spy and Undercity Informant were going to be the backbone of a very broken combo deck. Like, just 4 mana, mill your entire deck. Everyone knew it was going to be really good. So people tried playing the 60-card version, and then people realized that for just at the cost of a few more cards in your deck, you can play 8 more copies of Spy in the form of Neoform and Eldritch Evolution. You're not seeing Spy any less often because instead of 1 in every 7.5 cards being a Spy, it's now 1 in every 5. You are more likely to see Spy, less likely to draw the cards that you would want to mill over, and the combo is not less consistent because you're milling your entire library in one go. And so, ultimately, people settled on the 80-card version as being the better deck before the deck got banned. The second deck I want to highlight is the modern Lamplight Phoenix combo deck. Lamplight Phoenix is a creature that can bring itself back if you collect Evidence 6, I believe. And you combo this with Altar of Dementia, which is a card that allows you to sacrifice a creature for free in order to mill a player equal to the sacrificed creature's mana value. So you mill yourself out with the Lamplight Phoenix, and then you mill your opponent out by using all of the cards that you milled to exile. At 60 cards, this combo is fragile, to say the least. It is actually fairly likely to not mill your opponent out in time. However, going up just 8 cards is enough to make the combo so likely to succeed that you almost don't have to worry about it. Almost. And the final deck I want to go over is a little bit more of a meme, the 63-card Flumph Bowmasters combo. So, first, you give your Flumph indestructible, and then you use Bowmasters to target your own Flumph. Flumph will draw both you and your opponent a card, which, because your opponent drew a card, will trigger Bowmasters, and then Bowmasters will target the Flumph again. So, you both will draw a card, and then the Bowmasters will trigger again, and this happens over and over until one of you draws your deck out. And in order to make sure that your opponent is the one that draws their deck first, you play just a couple more cards in your deck. Will this deck just completely fold to something like the Lamplight Phoenix deck? Oh, absolutely. But decks that run more than 60 cards are so incredibly rare that it's almost a non-factor. And I also want to mention, not to step on the future testing and tuning episode, but I have heard of a method of testing a deck out that puts more than 60 cards in a deck just to get as many cards in a deck as possible to test out as many cards at one time as possible. So then you can cut the bad cards without having to add in cards afterwards. I don't know how well this method works. I don't use it myself, but it is something that I heard and I want to pass on to you. And so with all of that out of the way, Chaos Standard. I have 4 decks, 4 examples of decks that have gone over 60 cards. And all of them are going to be from the last format, although I might mention a couple of related decks in this format as well. I will start with the decks that have the most number of cards in them and go down from there. So, the first deck I want to mention is a blue-red control deck. This was a deck that went up to 130 cards. Why did it go that high? For the memes, Mason and I were in a call and we just started putting in some of the best cards in Izzet colors for a control deck, and we just kind of didn't stop putting cards in. And then eventually we just stopped putting cards in, and it ended up being about 130 cards. So we just rounded it out. And I want to tell you right now, it is okay to build a meme deck. It is absolutely fine. You just have to know what you are trying to do with the deck. If you are trying to win the tournament, maybe building a meme isn't the way to do it. The second deck I want to highlight is a deck that I legitimately almost submitted for the second format. It's an 80 card bug ramp deck. Why did I go to 80 cards? Well, it's for a couple of reasons. The first one is a little card called Solve the Equation. This is also the reason why the blue-red control deck could go up to 130, but you start getting diminishing returns after 80 cards, so I capped it at 80. Solve the Equation is a sorcery for 2 and a blue that says, search your library for any instant or sorcery, put it into your hand, and shuffle. So you can have all of the ramp cards, the ramp payoffs, counter spells, board wipes, you name it, put it in the deck, and then you can just end up tutoring out those cards. Also, the deck ran 15 learn cards and 10 lessons in the sideboard. So I would be seeing multiple lessons every single game because I had a critical mass of learn cards, right? Like compare the number of learn cards to the number of spies in the Pioneer Spy deck, right? 15 versus 16. That's almost the same number. So I was seeing a lot of them. But the thing that ties it all together is the sideboard. What was the rest of the sideboard if I had 10 lessons? It was 5 individually powerful but niche sideboard cards. And the reason I could run one of each was because of Solve the Equation. So instead of boarding into 1 copy of a card, I was boarding into 5 copies of it, which, in a deck that really likes its sideboard space to be taken up by lessons, is a really powerful thing to have. The third deck that I want to highlight is a 69 card Temur ramp deck. I also built an 88 card version, a little bit as a meme, but a little bit seriously. The reason why I went above 60 cards in the first place is because of a little card called Valakut the Molten Pinnacle. A land that enters tapped and taps for red, but whenever a mountain enters the battlefield, if you control at least 5 other mountains, Valakut then deals 3 damage to any target. Historically, there have been Valakut Scapeshift decks in Modern. Some of them went straight green-red, or, maybe like splashed 1 or 2 cards other than that in like Amulet Titan decks. But historically, those decks have played 3 or even 4 colors, with cards like Cryptic Command being part of the deck. And so, when you want to hit so many control/ramp cards in those decks and have enough mountains to scape shift into, you sometimes ended up playing more than 60 cards in those decks. And that's exactly what's happening here. Except instead of scape shifting, you are just harrowing. So if you draw too many non-mountain sources, you can sack one of them to then get 2 more onto the battlefield. So you are not only ramping, but you're also getting closer to your Valakut win condition. Very neat stuff. I really like the deck a lot. And finally, the deck that I actually did submit for Season 2, a 61 card green splash blue Stompy deck. I talked a little bit about that deck in the interview with Huey, but it's a deck that likes to go turn 1 Mana Dork into turn 2 Steel Leaf, and then back it up with counter spells like Spell Pierce and Decisive Denial. And what, dear listener, was the 1000 IQ Giga Chad reason that I played 61 cards in this deck? Simply put, I didn't know what to cut. I looked at my deck for at least half an hour. No joke, half an hour. I looked at all of the lands. I looked at the non-creature spells. I looked at the creature spells. I looked at every single ratio of every single card, and I could not come up with a card to cut. Was there a card in that deck that I could have cut in order to make the deck 100% unequivocally better? Not only is that possible, it was even likely. Could I, standing before you today, tell you which card that was? Absolutely not. I'm not that good of a player. Was that the reason why I lost that season? Well, the difference between 60 and 61 is fairly negligible, but I don't really like giving myself that excuse. It's entirely possible that I could have lost because I had an extra card in the deck, but I would rather just build a better deck, you know? And I think that's the lesson for today. If your deck is a 60 card deck, then make it a 60 card deck. My Bug Ramp deck did start out as a 60 card deck, but I realized that I just needed more cards in order to go bigger than the other mid-range control ramp decks that were around at the time. And it actually improved because of it. So, do what's best for your deck. But, as a rule of thumb, maybe you do want to go 60 cards. And that leads us into the outro. We are currently in the middle of the tournament, but I still want to highlight a couple of really cool decks from this format because there are just too many cool decks that were built by me and others that I just wanted to share. First, a deck from me, and this is an idea that came from Mason. He sent me a YouTube short talking about Simic Ascendancy in Commander, but the first combo that was in that video was Simic Ascendancy plus Body of Research. Simic Ascendancy is an enchantment that says whenever you put a 1/1 count, 1 or more 1/1 counters on a creature you control, you put that many growth counters on it. And then at the beginning of the upkeep, if it has 20 or more growth counters, you win the game. And Body of Research is a 6 mana sorcery that creates a 0/0 and then puts X 1/1 counters on it, where X is the number of cards in your library. So, for just 6 mana, you are now creating 2 lethal threats. 1 creature that threatens your opponent's life total, and an enchantment that's going to win the game on your next upkeep. We decided to put this into a Bant control list, but it could very feasibly go anywhere else. I remember having a game where I actually didn't draw Body of Research, but I did draw multiple Kracies, and the Kracies plus the Fractal Summoning in the lesson board was actually enough to threaten game. Very sweet. The second deck I want to highlight is an Abzan Reclamation deck. And you might be thinking Abzan, but Abzan doesn't have Magma Opus. And you're right, Abzan does not have Magma Opus. This is not your typical Temur Rec deck where you're playing your counter spells and you're playing your big splashy instance. You are playing a mid-range deck, an Abzan mid-range deck, and then going over the top with really big mana. And what are you pumping your mana into? Well, besides your usual Arch of Erazka and campuses, you can pump your mana into a Biogenic Ooze to create multiple oozes in the same turn. You can pump it into a Profane Procession, which allows you to exile multiple creatures per turn cycle and have it flip over faster. Or you could pump it into one of my favorite cards of all time, Harness Infinity. This is an instant that costs 1 generic, triple black, and triple green, and reads, exchange your hand and graveyard, exile Harness Infinity. So all of the spells that you played up to that point go straight into your hand. And you might even still have mana left over to cast some of the instant speed removal spells that you played earlier in the game so that you don't have to discard as many cards to hand size. It is one of those cards that just absolutely turns the game around in your favor, if you're not immediately dying on board, of course. And the last deck that I do want to highlight is the Temur Rec deck. I know, it's Temur Rec, but instead of using usual kill condition of like Electro Dominance or Hydroid Krasis, I want to highlight a different kill. Teach by Example plus Searing Wind. Teach by Example costs double hybrid Izzet mana for an instant that reads, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. And you combine it with Searing Wind, which is just 9 mana, deal 10 to any target. And I've heard that dealing 20 damage to the opponent's face is a way to close out the game. So you don't even need to focus on like doing too much more damage. I know life gain does exist. I know that Cram Session is a pretty decent card to put in Reclamation decks, for example. But you can combine Teach by Example and Searing Wind with Electro Dominance. So you can Teach by Example the Electro Dominance, and then the Electro Dominance can free cast a Searing Wind in order to do just mind-boggling amounts of damage. And that is all that I have for you on this episode. Please let me know what you think of this episode and other episodes down in the comments below. And if you want to join us, link as always is in the description. We'll be more than happy to see you there. And that's all I have for now. So thank you for listening to this episode, and I will see you next time. Chaos Standard, the whole point of the podcast. We finally got there.